So you want to make beef bone broth, but you're not sure which bones to choose? Don't worry. Today, I'm going to tell you which are the best bones to make beef bone broth with, as well as which ones are the most affordable. Hi, sweet friends. I'm Mary, and welcome to Mary's Nest. I'm a former New York City girl, now living the simple life with my husband here in the Texas Hill Country. And this channel is all about cooking from scratch, living naturally, and creating a cozy home with charming thrift store finds. So if you're like me and you want to live the simple life, be sure to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. I get a lot of questions about which are the best bones to use for when making beef bone broth. And I also get questions about which are the most affordable, yet will still make a good beef bone broth. And then third, I get questions about, can I reuse the beef bones? So we're going to talk about all of that today. Now, before we go over all the different types of bones for bone broth, I want to discuss the most important question that I get asked a lot. Can you reuse the bones after you've made one batch of bone broth? And the answer is yes. You can use beef bones multiple times to make multiple batches of bone broth, so it does become very affordable. I usually get at least 3 batches of nice gelatinous bone broth from my bones, and I make my bone broth in a 7-quart slow cooker, and I'll link to that video where I go through all the steps of making beef bone broth, and it's a very detailed video. And I'll also link in the description below to the slow cooker that I use. It's a 7-quart slow cooker, so you can make a nice big batch of beef bone broth. Now, I've known people who have gotten 12 batches of bone broth, and sometimes even more than that. It's amazing to me, and they call it their perpetual bone broth. And I'm actually in the process of doing that, and I'm going to be sharing that with you in the future about how to make perpetual bone broth. And although technically it's not perpetual bone broth, that you're using the same bones forever and ever, but the fact that you can get so many batches of gelatinous bone broth from one set of bones, it's been coined with the name perpetual bone broth. Okay, so now let's go over all the different types of bones that you can use when you make beef bone broth and what the range of costs is. Now, I've got a big selection of bones here, and you don't need to use all of these bones in every batch of bone broth you make. I have my favorites, but I wanted to show you all the different bone options that you have and what the cost range is, and then to share with you which are my favorites and how they're very affordable. Now, the first bones that I want to discuss are marrow bones, and I'm just going to move them over here so we can focus on all the different bones one at a time. Now, marrow bones are just from the leg, and they have a lot of marrow inside, hence why they're called marrow bones. Now, the marrow is very nutritious, and so that adds good nutrition to your bone broth. And you can also just push it out of the bone as it's cooking and spread it on toast. I've shared that with you in my beef bone broth video about how actually very delicious it is. Or you can just whip it more or less into your beef bone broth when it's a finished product and take the nutrition that way. But the reason that you put marrow bones in bone broth is because the actual bone contains collagen. And when you soak this in acidulated water, either with some vinegar or I like to use white vermouth. That's because Julia Child recommends cooking with white vermouth in her cookbooks. So I always like to use white vermouth, and I think it adds a nice flavor to the bone broth. But any kind of acid that will help leach out the collagen from the bones will then make your bone broth gelatinous. So that's one of the reasons why marrow bones are very popular for being used in bone broth. Now, marrow bones are relatively easy to find, especially now with the popularity of people making bone broth. So you may be able to find these at the grocery store or at specialty grocery stores like Whole Foods, but they should be able to be available at your local grocery store as well. And then there's going to be a difference on whether they're just commercially raised bones or whether they're from cattle that's been grass-fed or organic and so on and so forth. And they'll be labeled as such. Now, I always like to add at least a few marrow bones to my bone broth. And marrow bones can range in price for as often as low as maybe 90 cents but as high as maybe $7 or $8, and that's by a pound. So you really kind of have to shop around, and you have to decide on what level of bones you want to buy, whether just commercially raised or organic or grass-fed, so on and so forth. I sometimes find marrow bones at my grocery store. I don't usually buy them at Whole Foods. If I'm going to go to that level of buying marrow bones that are organic and or grass-fed, I usually order them online. And I know a lot of you have asked me, because I don't mention it in my beef bone broth video, you're asking me, where do I buy my bones? And I buy them from a place called U.S. Wellness Meats. Or I think that's the full name of the company, or U.S. Wellness Meats. And I'll put a link in the description below. And be sure to check the description. It's what's right underneath this video. You'll see something will say show more. And then if you click on that, it will open up a big description. I have a lot of information in there. And in there, I'll put a link to U.S. Wellness Meats. I love buying bones from them. I bought bones from different places online, but I find that they have the best, in my personal opinion, in my, what do we say, in my humble opinion. They are grass-fed. And they're very high quality, and they've always made a wonderful bone broth for me. The next bones I want to talk about are what are called shanks. Now, sometimes you'll see these labeled ossobuco in the grocery store, ossobuco. They are usually veal shanks that people will make a recipe with and whatnot. But really, they can be expensive, and you don't want to use those to make bone broth. What you want to get are just your plain old beef shanks. And they'll be very meaty like this, and then they'll have the little round bone in the middle that's filled with the marrow. And the reason that these are nice for bone broth is because they're very meaty, so you're going to brown these in the oven first, and then put them into the acidulated water in which the marrow bones are soaking, and then you're going to add this into your bone broth along with all the drippings from the pan. You're going to deglaze the pan and add that into your bone broth, which is going to give wonderful color and wonderful flavor. And then after cooking your bone broth for 12 hours in the slow cooker, and I have to confess that I really lean to the slow cooker. I know a lot of you have shared with me that you like making it in the pressure cooker, specifically the Instant Pot or something like that. And I did make turkey bone broth in the Instant, well, I don't have an Instant Pot, I have a Mealthy. It's the same thing, basically. And so I have done it that way. But I find I really like the product that I get out of the slow cooker, so that's why I'm talking about it. But in any event, you'll want to deglaze the pan and then add that either to your Instant Pot or to your slow cooker, so that you get that nice browned meat flavor and color. So that's what these are very good for. And I just want to say that the reason that I tend to favor the slow cooker is because, as I said, I like the end product. And why do I like the end product? I find the flavor and the level of gelatinousness, if that's a word, is just wonderful as compared to the product that I get out of the pressure cooker. So that's why I lean to it, but everybody's different. You know, it doesn't matter how you make your bone broth, just as long as you're making it. So if you like making it in an Instant Pot or whatever pressure cooker you may have, that's fine. Just be sure to make bone broth. So getting back to the shanks, these can run around $1.50 a pound too, and let me check here, I wrote it down, upwards of $10 a pound. And again, it depends on the level of quality. Are they just commercially raised that you're buying at your grocery store? Are they organic? Are they grass-fed? So on and so forth. But they start around $1.50 a pound. And what you want to do is, after these have been cooked for bone broth in your slow cooker or on your stovetop, you can do it on your stovetop too, I didn't mention that. Again, for beef bone broth it would be 12 hours, or in your Instant Pot, which I think that's like 2 hours, it's very fast. You'll want to eat the meat, so you're not going to discard the meat. Or if you want, you can add it back in you can brown it up a little more if you want, and then add it back in for your second batch of bone broth. But if you want to eat it at that time and make your next batch of bone broth without the meat from the bone, that's fine too. Whatever, it's all personal preference. Now the next bones that I want to talk about are short ribs. A lot of people will put short ribs in the bone broth. I don't. Short ribs are a little expensive. They can be grass-fed upwards of $10 a pound. Now they're going to be less if they're just the commercially raised ones that you buy at your grocery store. But even so, I find them one of the more pricey bones to add to a bone broth. And also short ribs are just something nice to cook and to eat. And I really prefer to use things in bone broth that are less likely to be used to make a full dish, a full meal like short ribs would be. But again, if you do use them in your bone broth, these are ones that you'll want to brown and then add them to whatever vessel you're using to make your bone broth, and then deglaze the pan at which you've browned them. And you're going to brown them at about 350 degrees Fahrenheit in your oven, for about an hour or so. You want them really nice and brown. Then you're going to deglaze your pan. You're going to add that to the vessel in which you're making your bone broth. You're going to add these in, and then after 12 hours, you can remove these. They're going to be incredibly tender. Brown them up and eat them, and then whatever bone you have left, you can throw that back in to make your second batch, and so on and so forth, of bone broth. But again, they are a little more pricey, and so they're not my first choice when it comes to making bone broth. However, they make a nice bone broth in the sense that they add wonderful color, wonderful flavor, and you're going to get collagen from the bones, and there's some little bits of, the fat that's going to leach into it and melt off and rise to the top, which you then can, later gather. You can either keep that in your bone broth. I always like to skim the fat off, and a lot of people have said, "What are you doing? The fat is good." I definitely keep the tallow. I love it, and I cook with it. But when it comes to drinking the bone broth, I like to skim the fat off the top. But you're going to get some wonderful tallow from having short ribs in your bone broth. But again, they are a little on the pricey side, so they're often not my first choice. The next bones I want to talk about are the star of the show, in my opinion. I love oxtails. Now, when you're looking for these, whether at the grocery store or a specialty grocery store like Whole Foods, or you're ordering them online, you're often going to find them in very varying sizes. And they might be packaged just 2 big ones like this, or they might be packaged just a lot of little ones like this, or they may be packaged 1 big one with some little ones. And in case you're not familiar with oxtails, it is, as it says, it's the tail of the cow. And so your bigger pieces are from higher up on the tail, and then these small little ones are way down at the very end of the tail. And they're all excellent. Oxtails are loaded with, you've got the meat, you've got the fat, and you've got a great bone that, if you can see this, it's very almost, to a certain extent, soft. It's very rich in collagen, which makes a wonderful gelatinous broth. But they are a little pricey. Now, you might be able to find them relatively reasonably, a few dollars a pound at your local grocery store. But grass-fed ones are going to run probably upwards of $10. But the good news is you don't have to put a lot of oxtails in your bone broth. If you have 1 big one like this and maybe a few little ones, I like to roast mine up and get them nice and brown, and then deglaze, as I said, deglaze the pan, add that, to the vessel in which I'm making the bone broth. And this is what I like to think of as my insurance policy. This will, oh, that's Obi. I'm talking bones. She's barking. For those of you who are new to my channel, that's my dog, Obi-Wan, and I'm sure she would love one of these bones. But in any event, as I was saying, I just consider these my insurance policy because they give wonderful flavor. I am able to get some nice beef fat after I chill my bone broth. Or defat it and then chill the fat separately. I get some nice fat. I get a beautiful gelatinous broth from this wonderful tailbone here, and it's just the perfect addition. So even though they are a little more on the costly side, you're not adding a lot. So when you bring them home, break up the package and know that something like this, boy, this one is actually quite a large one. If I was making bone broth with this, I might just add just this one. So be sure to look for these in your grocery store or order them online. As I said, in the grocery store, it's probably going to be a couple of dollars a pound. Maybe they're going to start around $2 a pound and go up from there, because some grocery stores will just have the basic commercially raised ones. Some will have ones that are grass-fed or natural or less processed, so on and so forth, and the price will go up. I believe I actually bought these from my local grocery store, and they were actually about $5 a pound. So somewhere in between what I've seen as the lowest price, around $2 a pound, but considerably lower than a grass-fed one for $10 a pound. But the grass-fed ones, I must confess, are my favorite. And I do like to buy those and order them from US Wellness Meats. And then, but I use them sparingly, because usually one or two will make a nice gelatinous broth. I'm not sure if I've already mentioned this, but before we move on to the next set of bones, I just wanted to mention about the tail releases a lot of collagen into the bone broth because it's rich, it's cartilage, and the cartilage is what's very rich in the collagen, which then makes the bone broth very gelatinous. And so that's what you're really looking for when you're making bone broths. You want to find those bones that have a lot of cartilage. So that's why when you're making bone broth, marrow bones are great, but the amount of collagen that's actually in the bone is considerably less than the amount of collagen that's in the cartilage. So that's why you want a combination of both types of bones. And that brings us to one of my favorite bones. Now, I know I said I love oxtails, and I do, but the neck bone, that's what this is. The neck bone is terrific because you've got bone, you've got cartilage, you've got meat, you've got fat, you've got everything here. This is a terrific bone for making bone broth, and it's very affordable in comparison to some of the other bones. So what I like to do with neck bones is brown them in the oven, since we do have some nice meat on them, and then again, add them to the acidulated water with the marrow bones, deglaze the pan, add that into the water that's already in my slow cooker or whatever vessel you're cooking in, and then you've got nutrition coming off the bone, you've got the cartilage in here that's going to melt and soften and make the bone broth gelatinous, and you've got this wonderful meat that's been browned to add color and flavor to your bone broth. And you may be able to find these at your local grocery store. And depending on where you shop, these can sometimes be as reasonable as 90 cents a pound. Some grocery stores will sell these and they'll be labeled, although they're fine for human consumption, they'll be labeled puppy dog bones or something. I've actually seen them at Whole Foods labeled as puppy bones. So shop around for these, and again, the price varies on the level of quality, of the bone. But I think that overall, bones can be nutritious, and as I've stressed in a number of my videos that I did right in the beginning when I started my YouTube channel, where I talk about mastering the basics of traditional foods cooking, and I start talking about making bone broth, that I think the most important thing is to make bone broth and make it with what's ever comfortable in your price range, because regardless of what bones you buy, there is nutrition, and we want to make nutritious food affordable and attainable. So don't say, oh, I can't make bone broth because I can't get the most perfect grass-fed bone, so on and so forth. Get what's in your price range and start making bone broth, and it's going to be nutritious. So as I've said, you may find these for as low as 90 cents a pound. And then again, grass-fed is going to be higher, possibly upwards of $7 or so a pound. But they really offer a little bit of everything. So I highly recommend searching out some neck bones. Oh, and this is important. I just want to clarify one thing that I had said earlier. When I mentioned that these were labeled puppy bones or puppy dog bones, it was meant for them, the seller was indicating to feed them to your dog. They're beef bones. So I just want to clarify that. I don't want anybody to misunderstand that people will buy these who feed raw diets to their dogs. And so that's sometimes they're marketed that there's something to feed to your dog, but they're beef bones. So far, the bones that we've gone over for the most part are what I call the mainstream bones. At one time or another, I've seen all of these bones, marrow bones, shanks, short ribs, neck bones, and oxtails at my local grocery store. I've also seen them at specialty grocery stores like Whole Foods, and certainly all of these can be ordered online from U.S. Wellness Meats or whatever grass-fed type meat company you like to order from. But these are all pretty mainstream and relatively easy to find. Oxtails can sometimes be a little difficult at times of the year when the butcher may feel that they're not going to sell, because oxtails are something that are made in some traditional dishes with certain cultures and certain religions at springtime. So often in the spring you'll see a lot of oxtails in your grocery store. However, with bone broth becoming more popular, you are starting to see these types of bones, oxtails specifically, all year long. But for the most part, they're pretty mainstream. Now I want to talk about some bones that can be a little more difficult to find. Although I have seen them at my grocery store or at Whole Foods, I've always seen them available online. But I've not seen them regularly, and sometimes they're not labeled as specifically to specifically what they are, or to identify them specifically as to what they are. They may just be in a package labeled soup bones. And so you may not be familiar with what type of bone they are. And I want to go over them now, and I want to talk about what they add to a bone broth and why they can be nice to add in. The first bone I want to talk about is called a knuckle bone. And this one I believe I found this at a specialty grocery store. I believe I found this at Whole Foods. And this one looks like it's cut in half, as you can see on this side, and then, where it was cut in half. And then this is the outer side. Now this is a hip bone. It's more or less taken from the hip area of the cow. And it's a very nice bone to add to bone broth. Now, if you can find it, it's usually sold either cut in half like this or whole. And it'll just look kind of fatty and a little meaty on the outside and be somewhat round. I couldn't find one like that, but that's pretty much what you'd be looking for. And one will weigh sometimes about a half a pound. And you may find one knuckle bone for as little as $2. But again, if you're searching out grass-fed and so on and so forth, you may find one knuckle bone for $7 or higher. And the reason people like to add one knuckle bone into their bone broth is it does assist with helping add some additional gelatin. There's some cartilage, there's some fat, there's meat. You can brown this if you want or not brown it. You're just using the one, you're probably just going to be putting one knuckle bone into your bone broth. But it does help add some gelatin. It does help create a gelatinous broth. So that's why knuckle bones are sometimes sought out. And if you can find one, great, and add it into your bone broth. But if not, don't worry. You can definitely make a wonderful bone broth without a knuckle bone. Well, now we're down to the last bone that I want to share with you, which is the most unusual and probably the most difficult to find. But I just want you to know about this so that if you are shopping and see it, you'll know exactly how it fits into making bone broth. And then I'm going to go over with you which bones of all of these I like to use to make what I consider a really nice gelatinous bone broth, and one that's also affordable. Now these bones are called the patella bones. Sometimes you might see them labeled patella femur, and sometimes just patella. And what this is this is the kneecap. And it's got a lot of cartilage. So these are often sought out as a wonderful bone for making bone broth because it does create a very gelatinous broth. And sometimes it'll have some of the femur, which is the thigh bone, attached to it. Sometimes it'll just be looking like this, more or less, with the kneecap. And they're all going to look different because it really depends, you know, how sometimes they'll just look cut like this, and you might see something sticking out over here. Sometimes it may look like this. And the reason I wanted to show you these is sometimes you may not necessarily see them sold separately where it says patella bone or patella femur bone. You may see this type of bone in a package just labeled soup bones or beef bone broth bones, or however your grocery store may label them. And the butcher is just throwing in little bits of this and that, and you sometimes may see one of these in there, so you'll know what it is now. And it is going to make a very nice gelatinous broth. And what's good about knowing about all of these bones is that you may not be able to find the bones that you want all the time. And if you can't, you can say, well, I can't find oxtails, but I can find patellas. I can't find patellas, but I can find neck bones, and so on and so forth. So knowing the variety of bones that you can use to make bone broth and create a gelatinous bone broth is very important. And you might be saying, oh my gosh, why is Mary constantly stressing the gelatinous aspect of bone broth? Because even if your bone broth doesn't come gelatinous, it's still nutritious. It has a lot of vitamins and minerals in it. But the nice thing about having a gelatinous bone broth is that's what helps moisturize, so to speak, our own joints, because the collagen we have in our joints and the gelatinous bone broth is very healing and nurturing to our joints. And it's also the aspect of bone broth that is very good for the gut. And that's what you always hear, drink bone broth. It's very healing to your gut. And it's the gelatinous nature of the bone broth that's very healing and coating and soothing to our gut. And when you nurture and take care of your gut and your gut is healthy, that's when your gut flora, the good bacteria, really proliferates. And as we are learning now from scientists, the better our gut health, the better our gut flora, and the better overall health we have. And these patella bones, as I mentioned, if you do find them, you may find them packaged in, if they're just packaged by themselves, maybe packaged 2 pieces like this. And it may be as reasonable as $2. And even for grass-fed patellas, you may be able to get a pound, pound and a half or so for maybe $5. It really varies. So what beef bones are my favorite to make beef bone broth with and keep it affordable? Well, my favorites are to go with the marrow bones and an oxtail, and maybe a few little pieces of oxtail as well, and at least one big oxtail. And then the neck bones. These are wonderful, and I just find them to be affordable, and they make a lovely bone broth. And it's a real nice substitute for using, instead of using the shank, which is going to be more expensive, or the oxtail, or not the oxtail, or the short rib, which is going to be even more expensive. So I find that when I can find neck bones at my local grocery store or ordering them online, and for those of you, you know, as you all know, I live in Central Texas, and we have a wonderful grocery store chain called H-E-B, and if you're in Texas, and there might be in Oklahoma too, I'm not sure, but if you have the ability to shop at H-E-B, they usually have a very nice selection of bones. And whenever I can get neck bones, these are my favorite because they brown up, they give nice color, nice flavor, and really are a nice replacement for the more expensive short ribs or shanks. So look for these and think about making beef bone broth with neck bones. And after they've cooked and you go to eat some of the meat off of the neck bones, it's very flavorful. So just to recap, I've got about 3 marrow bones, which I'll soak in some acidulated water, and then I'll brown about 4 neck bones. along with my oxtail and also the little pieces of oxtail too. I've got about 5 little ones there, and then the one big one. I'll brown those, and that all together is what I will use to make a batch of bone broth in a 7-quart slow cooker. And if you're using a pressure cooker, I think this amount would fit in. If it's too much to fit in, I would just remove 1 marrow bone, because I know these can kind of take up a lot of space. So if you are making it in a pressure cooker, I would do 2 marrow bones, the 4 neck bones, the large oxtail, and some of the littler pieces of the oxtail. If you'd like to learn more about making bone broth, be sure to subscribe to my channel and then click on this video over here where I show you how to make beef bone broth from start to finish. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.